In the eerie darkness of 1980s Los Angeles, a chilling shadow loomed over the city. Known as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez became one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Driven by a twisted blend of violence, Satanism, and chaotic desires, his reign of terror gripped Southern California, leaving fear and devastation in his wake. This story explores his horrific acts, the tireless pursuit of justice, and the eventual unraveling of his dark world. Chapter 1. A Troubled Beginning. Richard Ramirez's story began long before the name, the Night Stalker, haunted the streets of Los Angeles. It began in a small, modest house in El Paso, Texas, on February 28, 1960, where he was born to Mexican immigrant parents, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. He was the youngest of 5 children in a household where poverty and dysfunction ruled. From the very start, Richard's world was one defined by hardship and a lack of emotional support. Richard's father, Julian, was a stern man who worked long hours as a laborer in the Texas sun. His presence in the home was often defined by a mixture of physical and emotional distance. Julian had been a strict disciplinarian, believing in corporal punishment as the primary method of instilling obedience in his children. His harshness was fueled not only by a sense of authority, but also by a deep-seated frustration with his own life. Julian's experiences as a former policeman in Mexico and the violence he had witnessed in his youth shaped his view of the world. This philosophy was passed on to Richard through frequent beatings, not just for bad behavior, but for trivial infractions, making the young boy's early life one of constant fear and confusion. Mercedes, Richard's mother, was a deeply religious woman, but her devotion to her faith did little to ease the tension in the household. Although she was the more emotionally present of the 2 parents, her ability to comfort her children was often overshadowed by her passive acceptance of the abusive nature of Julian's parenting. In Richard's young mind, love was equated with fear and discipline with cruelty. There was no balance, no softness in the home. Instead, Richard learned that survival came through submission and avoidance, keeping quiet to avoid angering his father, and withdrawing to his own thoughts when the violence became unbearable. As a child, Richard was constantly in pain. He suffered from frequent headaches, a condition that would go unnoticed or ignored by his parents. These physical pains would eventually manifest in darker ways as Richard grew older, feeding into the isolation that he would come to embrace. The migraines became a metaphor for the turmoil inside him, a deep well of discomfort that had no outlet except for his increasingly violent thoughts. The brutality he experienced at home shaped his view of the world, one where power came only through dominance, where others were either weak or deserving of punishment. His school years were no better. Richard was a quiet, withdrawn child, not particularly gifted academically, and often the target of bullying. He was small for his age and lacked the social skills that would allow him to blend in with the other children. In a community that prided itself on family and connection, Richard found himself on the outskirts. His teachers described him as shy and unremarkable, someone who blended into the background, neither making waves nor seeking attention. But underneath this exterior, Richard's mind was already beginning to form a worldview that would later manifest in terrifying ways. He found solace in his fantasies of violence, and these fantasies provided an escape from the reality of his abusive home life. The turning point in Richard's early years came when he was 12 years old. It was then that he was introduced to his older cousin, Miguel. Miguel had recently returned from the Vietnam War, and his presence in Richard's life would become a defining moment. Miguel had seen and participated in the atrocities of war, and he was not shy about sharing the graphic details of his experiences with his young cousin. For Richard, these stories were not just horrifying, they were mesmerizing. They gave him a sense of power and agency, things he had never felt in his own life. Miguel taught Richard how to kill small animals, first with knives, then with firearms. These acts of cruelty were presented not as a crime, but as a rite of passage, a way for Richard to prove his strength. Miguel's influence on Richard went beyond just the violent acts. He also exposed Richard to a more insidious side of the world, Satanism. Miguel had dabbled in occult practices, and he often spoke to Richard about the power of the devil. He showed him images of satanic rituals and told him stories of how Satan could offer power and freedom from the pain of everyday life. For a boy already steeped in a world of violence and confusion, these ideas were intoxicating. The notion of surrendering to a dark force, of rejecting the world of rules and morals that had tormented him, began to resonate deeply with Richard. In his mind, Satanism represented liberation, a way to take control of his life and his actions. By the time Richard was in high school, he had become increasingly detached from the world around him. He had few friends, and his only outlet for his anger and frustration was in petty crimes, breaking into cars, stealing valuables, and starting fires. His family had moved to the more affluent part of El Paso, and Richard, feeling like an outsider, grew even more resentful of the wealth and success of others. He began to harbor a deep hatred for those who lived normal, peaceful lives. In his mind, they were weak and undeserving of their comfort. He felt as though he had been forsaken by the world, and this sense of abandonment fueled his growing desire for vengeance. Richard's behavior at school became more erratic. His grades continued to slip, and he became known for his erratic mood swings. He spent more time at the local library, devouring books about Satanism, witchcraft, and occult practices. He was drawn to the darker side of religion, looking for something that could explain his pain and provide a sense of purpose. During this time, he also began to experiment with drugs, marijuana, cocaine, and later LSD. These substances provided him with an escape from the anger and confusion that plagued him, allowing him to numb his mind and surrender to the fantasies of violence that were increasingly dominating his thoughts. It was during this period of experimentation that Richard's sense of morality began to break down. The drugs allowed him to justify his darker impulses, while the occult beliefs provided him with a framework for understanding the world in terms of power and dominance. He started to see himself as a vessel for something greater than himself, someone chosen to carry out the will of a dark force. This belief system would eventually lead him to commit his first murder, but before he could act on his impulses, he had to leave his family behind. At the age of 18, Richard moved to California, seeking a fresh start away from the confines of his broken home. He found himself in Los Angeles, a sprawling city that promised anonymity and freedom from his past. But for Richard, the city was not a place of opportunity. It was a playground for his darker inclinations. He quickly adapted to the fast-paced, chaotic lifestyle of the city, engaging in petty theft, burglary, and eventually, violent acts. It was in Los Angeles that Richard Ramirez would transform from a troubled, violent young man into a monster that terrorized the entire region. But before he became the infamous Night Stalker, Richard was just another faceless criminal in a city filled with crime. His early burglaries were simple, nonviolent affairs. He would sneak into homes at night, steal what he could find, and slip away undetected. But as time passed, the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. He began to take more risks, breaking into homes at night when the occupants were present. His first violent encounter occurred when he attacked a woman during a burglary, tying her up and sexually assaulting her. It was a pivotal moment in Richard's life, marking the point at which his crimes would evolve into something far darker. As Richard became more comfortable with violence, he began to embrace his identity as a predator. The innocence of his early burglaries gave way to something more sinister, something that would come to define him for the rest of his life. He no longer needed to hide in the shadows, stealing in the dead of night. Instead, he became a creature of the darkness, a force of terror that would leave a trail of broken lives in his wake. The name Richard Ramirez would soon become synonymous with fear, and the legacy of his troubled beginnings would come to define the monster he would become. Chapter 2. The Descent into Darkness. By the time Richard Ramirez left El Paso at the age of 18, he was already beginning to take steps toward his ultimate transformation from a troubled young man to one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. But his departure from his family home was not an escape from the darkness within him. Rather, it was a move to a larger stage where his deepest, most destructive impulses could find an outlet. Los Angeles, with its sprawling streets and impersonal nature, seemed like the perfect place for Richard to disappear into the anonymity he so desperately craved. But the city would not just serve as a backdrop for his crimes. It would become the setting for his horrifying evolution. The culture of Los Angeles in the late 1970s and early 1980s was one of excess, confusion, and decay. It was a city in the throes of a complex transformation. Urban sprawl and economic disparity were on the rise, and crime was rampant in certain neighborhoods. The sprawling metropolis offered both a sense of freedom and a sense of danger. It was a place where anyone could reinvent themselves, but also a place where the fragile thread of morality could easily snap. For Richard Ramirez, The city was a playground where he could test the boundaries of his depravity. At first, Richard's life in Los Angeles seemed to mirror that of many other young men trying to make their way in the city. He took on menial jobs, working as a busboy in restaurants and in fast food chains. He had a low-paying job at a hotel, cleaning rooms, and doing the sort of work that gave him just enough to survive but not enough to thrive. His life was marked by an underlying sense of dissatisfaction, as he constantly sought ways to satisfy the gnawing emptiness inside him. The emptiness had nothing to do with material wealth. It had everything to do with the darkness that Richard had carried within him since childhood. His early years in Los Angeles were marked by brief interactions with people who would later fade from his memory, but they were also the beginning of a dangerous pattern. In the early months of his time in Los Angeles, Richard started to gravitate toward the underbelly of the city. It was a world filled with drugs, sex, and violence, a world where people were willing to ignore the law, where rules were bent or broken, and where the authorities rarely intervened. Richard found himself drawn to this world, not because he was addicted to any substance, but because it mirrored the chaotic, anarchic way he had come to see the world. The people he met in these environments seemed like reflections of his own disillusionment, a society that had turned its back on morality and embraced selfishness. It was in these neighborhoods that Richard first began committing small acts of violence. He started with petty theft, picking pockets and stealing wallets, a crime that offered him a small thrill. But it was not enough. The satisfaction that came from stealing material objects was fleeting. What Richard craved was something deeper. He wanted to feel in control. He wanted to dominate, and that craving began to evolve. In his early 20s, Richard had a brief encounter with a local girl, a woman who would later become a central figure in his twisted psychology. She was a young woman with a rebellious streak, much like Richard himself. They shared a few dates, but Richard quickly realized that the relationship was not going to offer him the escape or thrill he desired. Instead of cultivating intimacy or love, Richard grew more frustrated with the idea of a meaningful connection. His sense of alienation deepened, and the girl faded from his life. This was not the first time that Richard had attempted to form a connection with someone, only to abandon the effort when it became clear that the relationship could not satisfy his deeper urges. But by the time he let go of the girl, Richard was already well on his way down a far more destructive path. He started stalking women, following them at night, watching them from the shadows. His obsession with their vulnerability grew, and he began to develop a particular interest in the homes of strangers. It was at night that Richard felt most alive, most powerful, and he started breaking into homes, first by simply slipping through unlocked doors or windows, taking whatever he could find: money, jewelry, electronics. At first, these were crimes of opportunity, but they soon became much more deliberate. Richard would carefully choose his targets, scoping out the homes of women who lived alone or with children. These women represented something to him, something weak and fragile that he could control. Over time, Richard's burglaries grew bolder. He would steal into homes while the residents slept, taking what he needed and leaving without a trace. His behavior began to escalate as his sense of invincibility grew. He was no longer content with taking objects. He wanted to invade the lives of his victims in a far more personal way. His growing obsession with power and control found its outlet in sexual assault, and Richard began to attack his victims. The women he targeted were not just victims of a break-in. They were victims of his violent and twisted fantasies. Richard's escalating violence did not go unnoticed. Local police departments began to notice a pattern of increasingly brutal home invasions in Los Angeles. The break-ins shared similar characteristics. The victims were often assaulted, and their homes were ransacked. But there was no clear link between the cases. Richard's crimes seemed random, disconnected, as though he was testing the limits of what he could get away with. His signature was becoming more apparent, but the authorities were still unable to connect the dots. To the outside world, Richard Ramirez was still just another young man trying to find his way in a city that swallowed up people like him. He blended in with the masses, his scruffy appearance and disheveled look making him appear like just another face in the crowd. But beneath the surface, he was a man who was slowly becoming something far more sinister. The violence he had begun to inflict on women soon turned into a thirst for murder. In the summer of 1984, Richard took his first known victim, an elderly woman named Jenny Vincow. Her murder was brutal, a harbinger of the horrors to come. Richard entered her home through an unlocked window and attacked her as she slept. He tied her up, brutally assaulted her, and then killed her with a knife. The crime was horrific, but it was also calculated. Richard had planned it, his first true murder, and he felt a rush of exhilaration when it was done. The feeling of power, of being able to end a life with his own hands, was intoxicating. It was everything he had been seeking, a feeling of ultimate control. Jenny Vinco's murder was a turning point in Richard's life. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. The thrill of taking a life became an addiction, something that he needed to repeat over and over again. Richard's murders were not random acts of violence. They were deeply personal to him. He chose his victims carefully, selecting those who he believed were vulnerable and weak, women who reminded him of his own mother or of the women he had encountered in his early life. But it wasn't just about killing, it was about sending a message. Richard wanted the world to know that he was above the law, that he could strike whenever he wished and leave no trace. His crimes grew more brazen as he developed a twisted sense of invincibility. His signature, leaving satanic symbols at the crime scene, scrawling pentagrams on walls, and telling his victims that they had to swear to Satan, became a trademark of his killings. It was a way for him to proclaim his dominance, to make sure that everyone knew that he was not just a killer, but something more, a vessel for the power of darkness. As Richard's killing spree continued, the authorities were struggling to find any pattern to his crimes. His randomness made him an unpredictable and elusive target. But he was not done yet. The city of Los Angeles, unaware of the monster that was lurking in their midst, would soon be thrust into a waking nightmare. Chapter 3. The First Kill. The summer of 1984 marked a turning point for Richard Ramirez. It was the season that forever changed the course of his life, the season where his fantasies of violence became a deadly reality. Richard had spent years honing his obsession with death, his growing attraction to the control that came with brutality, and the twisted power that emerged when he took another person's life. For years, he had stolen from people's homes, violated their privacy, and left behind destruction. But now he was ready to take the final step. Now Richard Ramirez was ready to kill. The transition from being a petty thief to a violent killer was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow and deliberate descent into darkness that had been brewing since Richard's troubled childhood. His exposure to violence at an early age, the teachings of his older cousin Miguel, and his growing obsession with Satanism had all laid the groundwork for his first murder. By the time Richard committed his first kill, he had already been desensitized to the idea of inflicting pain on others. Murder, for him, was not just about ending a life. It was about claiming power, asserting his dominance, and releasing the darkness inside of him. It all began with a simple burglary. On the night of June 28, 1984, Richard entered the home of 79-year-old Jenny Vinco, an elderly woman who lived alone in the quiet neighborhood of Glassell Park, a working-class area in East Los Angeles. Like many of Richard's future victims, Jenny was a woman who lived a solitary life, removed from the chaos that Richard had grown to associate with his own existence. But to him, she represented something weaker, someone he could control, someone who could be bent to his will. She was the perfect target. Richard entered Jenny's home through an unlocked window. He knew the risks of breaking into a house at night, but he had learned to move quickly, efficiently, and without leaving a trace. He had done this countless times before, slipping in and out of homes like a ghost. But this time, things would be different. This time, there would be blood. Inside the house, Jenny was asleep in her bed. She had no way of knowing that a predator had entered her home, no way of anticipating the horror that was about to unfold. Richard, in his dark anticipation, crept through the house, his movements calculated and deliberate. He had been planning this moment for weeks, carefully selecting his target, and now that he was here, nothing would stop him. Richard approached Jenny's bed and attacked. He tied her up, bound her wrists and ankles, and then began to terrorize her. He sexually assaulted her, brutalizing her in ways that were both physical and psychological. For Richard, it wasn't just about the act itself. It was about the dominance, the power he held over her, the complete and utter control. He was no longer the frightened, abused boy who had once cowered in fear of his father. He was in charge now. He was the one who dictated the rules. As Jenny struggled, Richard became more enraged. The violence escalated, and soon, he turned to the knife he had brought with him. He stabbed her multiple times, each strike driven by his need to assert his power, to confirm that he was the one who controlled life and death. Jenny Vinco's life ended in that dark, lonely room, her body left in a grotesque and bloodied state. For Richard, it was a moment of euphoric release, a culmination of everything he had been building toward. The killing was not a mistake, it was a plan fulfilled. When the deed was done, Richard did not linger. He had no emotional attachment to his victim, no sense of guilt or remorse. He didn't even bother to clean up the scene. He simply slipped out of the house, taking whatever valuables he could find, and disappeared into the night. It was the perfect crime, or so he thought. For Richard Ramirez, murder had become as easy as stealing, as effortless as his other criminal acts. But the thrill he experienced in that moment was something he could not contain, a fire that would only burn brighter with each new life he took. The discovery of Jenny Vinco's body shocked the local community. The elderly woman had been well liked by her neighbors, and no one could understand who would want to harm her. The police initially treated her death as a robbery gone wrong. There was no immediate evidence to suggest that it was anything other than a random act of violence, a crime of opportunity. But something about the brutality of the attack caught the attention of investigators. The way Jenny had been tied up, the senseless violence, and the disturbing nature of the assault all pointed to a darker motive. For Richard, however, the murder was a confirmation of his power. He had entered the house a mere burglar, but he had left a killer, a man who had tasted the ultimate thrill. Jenny Vinco's murder was not just another crime. It was the start of something much bigger. It was a turning point that would shape the rest of Richard's life. His first taste of blood had left him craving more, and he soon began to plot his next kill. At first, Richard kept a low profile. He didn't immediately strike again after Jenny Vinco's murder, though the craving for violence never left him. His thoughts turned back to the women he had stalked, to the homes he had broken into, to the power he had felt when he took control. The desire to kill again began to consume him. He needed more. The thrill of murder was like a drug, and Richard was an addict. But unlike his first murder, Richard's subsequent killings would not come so easily. The city of Los Angeles had become a tinderbox, a city filled with fear, uncertainty, and mounting tension. News of the Vinco murder began to spread, and the city was on edge. People locked their doors more tightly, stayed in their homes after dark, and became more suspicious of strangers. But the sense of fear that permeated the city only fueled Richard's lust for power. He thrived on the fear he caused in others, the chaos he unleashed in the lives of his victims. Richard began to expand his range, looking for victims beyond the confines of his immediate neighborhood. He no longer limited himself to the homes of women living alone or in vulnerable positions. He began to target anyone he could overpower. He struck without warning, at any hour of the day or night, choosing his victims at random. It didn't matter who they were or where they lived. What mattered to Richard was that he could slip into their homes undetected, take what he wanted, and leave behind a legacy of terror. The second murder came just a few months after Jenny Vinco's death. In the early morning hours of March 17, 1985, Richard broke into the home of a young couple, Maria and Vincent Zazera. He shot them both, and once again his brutality escalated. After killing the couple, Richard ransacked their house, searching for valuables. But this time, he also left behind a chilling message. He scrawled a pentagram on the wall in the couple's blood, a symbol that would become synonymous with his identity as the Night Stalker. The murder of the Zazeras was a clear escalation from the Vinco killing. Richard was no longer content with simply taking a life. He wanted to leave a mark, to make sure that his actions were remembered. The pentagram, drawn in blood, was not just a signature. It was a symbol of his allegiance to Satan, a symbol that represented the darkness that had consumed him. For Richard, Satanism was not just a belief. It was a justification, a way to rationalize his violent urges, a way to absolve himself of any responsibility for the crimes he committed. The city of Los Angeles was no longer safe. The murders were becoming more frequent, and the fear among residents was palpable. People slept with weapons by their beds, installing security systems, and locking themselves inside their homes at night. But it didn't matter. Richard had learned to move swiftly and silently. He had become a shadow, a creature that thrived on the terror he left behind. Each time he killed, the city seemed to grow darker, more uncertain. And Richard thrived in that uncertainty. As his killing spree continued, Richard's notoriety grew. The media began to take notice of the pattern of murders, linking them to a single perpetrator, though they had no idea who he was. He was the Night Stalker, a name that struck fear into the hearts of everyone in the city. But for Richard, The name was just another source of satisfaction. He had become a figure of myth, a legend in his own right. And the legend of the Night Stalker was just beginning. The murders of the Zazeras and the brutal escalation of Richard's crimes were only the beginning. He would go on to kill at least 13 people, leaving behind a trail of blood, fear, and confusion. But the first kill, Jenny Vincow, was the moment when Richard Ramirez fully embraced his dark destiny. It was the night that set everything in motion, the night that marked the birth of the Night Stalker. Chapter 4. The Relentless Hunt. As Richard Ramirez's killing spree continued to unfold across Los Angeles, the city became engulfed by fear. The name Night Stalker was becoming synonymous with terror, with rumors and panic sweeping through neighborhoods from East LA to the quiet suburban streets. No one was safe from his reach. His brutality was as merciless as his ability to slip through the shadows, leaving only chaos and death behind him. What had begun as a single act of violence had grown into a series of random killings, each one more horrifying than the last, and Richard's thirst for blood seemed insatiable. For the victims, the terror came not just from the murders themselves, but from the unpredictability of them. Richard was a ghost. He struck without warning, without any apparent rhyme or reason. He would break into homes at night, entering through unlocked doors or windows, sometimes making no sound at all. His attacks were calculated and ruthless. He did not discriminate based on age or gender. In fact, his victims often came from all walks of life. Young, old men, women. No one was safe from the wrath of the Night Stalker. Richard's ability to adapt and learn from each crime allowed him to stay one step ahead of the police. He had become a shadow in the city, a phantom that no one could catch, no one could see. His randomness made him unpredictable, and as his crimes mounted, so did the police efforts to track him down. Yet every lead seemed to go cold. Every clue was a dead end. Richard was no fool. He knew how to cover his tracks. He left no fingerprints, and his ability to disappear into the night made him nearly impossible to catch. But his escalating crimes were beginning to catch the attention of law enforcement. As the body count grew, the police realized that the murders were connected, and they began to search for patterns in the chaos. Still, the investigation was slow. No solid leads, no eyewitnesses. And Richard was careful. Every night, he stalked a different part of the city, choosing new neighborhoods, new victims. He had no clear motive other than a need for dominance, a hunger for power. Every person he murdered was a victim of his twisted desire to control life and death. During this time, Richard began to leave behind clues that would later define him as a killer who thrived on fear and chaos. He would often scrawl strange, unsettling symbols on the walls of his victims' homes. Most notably, he would draw pentagrams, an image deeply linked to Satanism, a subject that had fascinated Richard for years. His obsession with the occult had been seeded in his childhood, fed by his troubled family life and reinforced by his cousin Miguel's disturbing tales of violence and murder. To Richard, Satanism was more than just a belief system. It was a justification for his actions, a way to absolve himself of any guilt. He was not a murderer in his eyes. He was simply carrying out the will of a higher power. At first, the police weren't sure what to make of the pentagrams. They seemed like a random part of the crimes, something added in the heat of the moment. But as more murders piled up, it became clear that these symbols were significant to the killer. For Richard, they were a signature, a stamp of ownership, and a declaration of his beliefs. He wasn't just killing to kill, he was making a statement. Every victim, every crime scene, was part of a larger narrative that only he understood. He was a self-proclaimed soldier of Satan, and his murders were offerings to a force that gave him the power he craved. With each passing day, the tension in the city grew. People were scared to leave their homes after dark, and the police were under increasing pressure to find the killer. Richard's ability to evade capture seemed almost supernatural, as if he were constantly slipping through the cracks of the system. But in his mind, his crimes were not random at all. Each killing, each brutal act, was part of a carefully crafted plan. He was on a mission, driven by a need to dominate, to control, and to revel in the fear he sowed. The more he killed, the more invincible he felt. He was untouchable. He was the Night Stalker, and no one could stop him. It was around this time that Richard's crimes began to take on an even more sinister aspect. He began to evolve his methods, refining them as he grew more confident in his ability to carry out these attacks. He became more daring, more willing to take risks. He no longer waited for the perfect moment. Instead, he would seize any opportunity that presented itself. He targeted couples in their homes, attacking them with a brutality that left no room for mercy. He would often shoot the male victims first, then turn his attention to the women. In some cases, he would tie them up and sexually assault them before killing them. In other cases, he would simply execute them, leaving them lying lifeless in pools of their own blood. Richard's need to kill was no longer just a compulsion, it was an obsession. He had become addicted to the violence, to the feeling of power it gave him. Each new victim was another fix, another step deeper into the abyss. His sense of detachment grew as well. The lives he took meant nothing to him. They were just stepping stones in his journey of self-gratification. The more he killed, the more detached he became from any notion of morality or empathy. His humanity was slipping away, replaced by the cold, calculating persona of the Night Stalker. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Night Stalker's identity was becoming more desperate. The media frenzy surrounding the case was at an all-time high. News outlets reported daily on the killings, and fear continued to grip the city. The police were stretched thin, and the constant media attention only made things harder. Every time they thought they were close to catching Richard, he managed to slip away. He had learned from his mistakes, adapted to the growing pressure, and continued to operate in the shadows. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no physical evidence to tie Richard to the murders. It seemed like an impossible task. In fact, the authorities had no idea who they were even looking for. The description of the killer was vague at best. He was described as a Latino man, about 6 feet tall, with long, dark hair, but beyond that, there was little to go on. Richard blended in with the population of Los Angeles, his appearance not standing out in any meaningful way. He was just another man in a city full of strangers. And that anonymity was his greatest weapon. But as the killings continued, the police began to piece together a chilling pattern. There was something undeniably random about the attacks, but there was also something methodical about them. The killings were not simply about violence, they were about the hunt. Richard's killings were acts of terror, meant to destabilize, to leave a wake of confusion and fear. His victims had no connection to one another, no common thread other than that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't care who they were. What mattered to him was the terror he left behind, the blood he spilled, and the fear he instilled in the hearts of the people of Los Angeles. The horror reached a fever pitch in the summer of 1985. The Night Stalker's reign of terror seemed to have no end in sight, and with every new victim, the police were left scrambling to catch up. They had no leads, no arrests, and the killings showed no signs of stopping. Richard was more brazen than ever, breaking into homes and attacking his victims without warning, often with nothing more than a gun or a knife to carry out his grisly deeds. By this point, Richard's crimes had become so notorious that the people of Los Angeles were desperate for any kind of relief. Rumors spread about the Night Stalker's identity. Some speculated that he was a disgruntled ex-convict. Others believed that he was a mentally ill loner acting out on impulses he couldn't control. But the truth was much more disturbing. Richard Ramirez was not a random, faceless monster. He was someone who had made a conscious decision to embrace his darkness, to live a life of violence and chaos. He had been planning this for years, and nothing was going to stop him. Richard's escalation was far from over. He was growing more erratic, more daring, and more bloodthirsty with each passing day. But his recklessness would eventually catch up with him. He was on the edge, and the police were getting closer to putting the pieces together. The hunt for the Night Stalker was intensifying, and soon, Richard's reign of terror would come to an end. But for now, Richard Ramirez remained the unseen predator in the night, a shadow who could not be caught. The fear he instilled in the hearts of the people of Los Angeles was palpable, but so was the growing sense of inevitability. Chapter 5. The End of the Line. The year was 1985, and Richard Ramirez's reign of terror was now in full swing. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, a name that struck fear in the hearts of all who lived in Los Angeles. He was a phantom, a shadow lurking in the night, terrorizing the city with a brutality that seemed to know no bounds. He had become more than a killer. He was a symbol of terror, a nightmare come to life. The police, the media, and the citizens of Los Angeles were desperate for an end to the nightmare. But Richard's ability to evade capture only fueled his sense of invincibility. He was untouchable. In the first half of 1985, Richard's attacks continued to escalate. He stalked the streets of Los Angeles, slipping in and out of homes with terrifying ease. His methods were becoming increasingly erratic, and his desire for dominance was growing stronger with every murder. Each attack was a reminder of his power, his control over life and death. He seemed to be everywhere at once, striking victims from different neighborhoods, using different methods, and leaving no identifiable trace. Despite the mounting evidence that a single killer was responsible for the series of gruesome murders, the police were struggling to make any progress. The killer had no discernible pattern. His victims came from all walks of life: young, old, male, female, couples, and singles. There was no rhyme or reason to his choice of targets. He would often break into homes at night, shooting the male victim first, before attacking the woman, sometimes sexually assaulting her before killing her. He left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, and often took only a few items from the homes. His motive, at first glance, appeared to be random, fueled by a compulsion that no one could fully understand. But to Richard, there was nothing random about his actions. Every crime was part of a larger narrative that only he understood. His crimes were not acts of senseless violence. They were deliberate and meaningful to him. Richard was driven by a deep inner darkness, a need for control, and an obsession with Satanism that had only deepened as his killing spree continued. Satanism, for Richard, was not just a belief system, it was a way of life. It was a way to explain the violence that flowed through his veins, a way to justify his growing bloodlust. He was not a man. He was a soldier of Satan, carrying out his master's will, and with every life he took, he believed he was getting closer to fulfilling his purpose. The murders were brutal and random, but they were also methodical in their execution. Richard was no amateur. He had been honing his skills for years, starting with petty thefts, escalating to more violent crimes, and finally becoming a serial killer. His ability to blend into the crowd, to go unnoticed, had made him an elusive target for law enforcement. They had no solid leads, and the lack of a clear motive made the case even more difficult to crack. Despite their best efforts, the police were stumped. Every lead they followed seemed to end in a dead end. Richard had become a ghost, a figure who could disappear into the night without a trace. Yet even as the police struggled to track him down, Richard was becoming increasingly reckless. His sense of invincibility was growing, and he was taking greater risks with each attack. He was no longer the cautious killer he had been in the beginning. He had become more daring, more desperate to feed the dark hunger that had taken root in his soul. His attacks were no longer just about murder. They were about domination, control, and terror. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be remembered. The turning point came on the night of August 24, 1985. It was a night like any other in Los Angeles, but for Richard Ramirez, it would mark the beginning of the end of his killing spree. On that night, Richard broke into the home of 22-year-old Maria Hernandez and her roommate, Dale Okazaki, in the quiet suburb of Rosemead, just east of Los Angeles. He had been stalking the neighborhood for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. He chose Maria and Dale as his next victims not because they were vulnerable or easy targets, but because he wanted to push himself further, to see how far he could go. Richard's attack began with Dale, who was sitting at her kitchen table when Richard entered the house. He immediately shot her in the face, killing her instantly. Maria, who had been in the other room, heard the gunshot and ran to the kitchen. She was horrified to see her friend's lifeless body on the floor, blood pouring from the wound in her head. In that moment, Maria froze, terror gripping her heart. But Richard wasn't finished yet. He turned his gun on her, but something unexpected happened. As he pointed the weapon at Maria, she ducked behind the kitchen counter, narrowly avoiding the fatal shot. In a panic, Maria scrambled to escape, running out of the house and into the driveway. Richard chased her, determined to finish what he had started. But as he ran after her, something unexpected happened again. Maria managed to escape. She ran across the street, pounding on the door of a neighbor's house, begging for help. The neighbor called the police, and Richard, realizing that his plan had been thwarted, fled into the night. Maria Hernandez survived the attack, but Dale Okazaki did not. The crime scene was a reminder of Richard's growing desperation. His attacks were no longer clean and efficient. His recklessness had begun to catch up with him. But while Maria had escaped, Richard had left behind a crucial piece of evidence, a witness who could describe the man who had attacked her. The next day, the police were finally able to piece together enough information to create a sketch of the killer. Maria's description of the man who had attacked her was detailed enough to provide investigators with a composite sketch of the night stalker. For the first time, the police had a face to go with the name. The sketch was released to the public, and it sparked a massive media frenzy. The people of Los Angeles, already on edge from the growing number of murders, were now even more terrified. The killer was real, and now they knew what he looked like. As the police began to follow up on the lead, Richard Ramirez grew increasingly paranoid. He knew the net was closing in on him. He was no longer the anonymous figure stalking the streets of Los Angeles. His face was now in the newspapers, on TV, and on the radio. The fear that he had once controlled was now turning against him. People who had once been terrified of the Night Stalker now knew who he was. And for Richard, the thought of being caught was more terrifying than anything else. He knew his time was running out. But even as the authorities closed in on him, Richard still believed he could outsmart them. He had done it before. He had evaded capture for months, slipping through the cracks of the justice system. But as his fear grew, so did his recklessness. He continued to commit more crimes, more violent attacks, as if he were trying to outrun his inevitable capture. On August 30th, 1985, Richard made his biggest mistake. After days of laying low, he ventured into the city of San Francisco, hoping to escape the growing heat in Los Angeles. But as he walked through the streets, he was spotted by a group of people who recognized him from the composite sketch. They had seen his face on the news, and they knew who he was. They didn't hesitate. They immediately called the police. By the time the authorities arrived, Richard had already been cornered. He tried to escape, but it was too late. The people who had spotted him were already holding him down, preventing him from running. The police arrived shortly afterward, arresting Richard Ramirez without a struggle. For the first time in over a year, the Night Stalker had been captured. His reign of terror was over. In the weeks that followed, Richard was charged with multiple murders, rapes, and other heinous crimes. The details of his crimes, the brutality of his attacks, and his twisted motivations were revealed to the public. The man who had once been a shadow in the night was now a convicted killer, facing the consequences of his actions. The city of Los Angeles could finally breathe again. The Night Stalker was no longer a threat. But for Richard Ramirez, the capture was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. He would stand trial for his crimes, facing the families of his victims, the people he had terrorized for over a year. The man who had once been feared was now a prisoner, awaiting justice for the lives he had taken. Chapter 6. The Trial and the Aftermath. After over a year of terror, Richard Ramirez, the notorious Night Stalker, was finally in custody. His arrest in August 1985 had sent shockwaves through the city of Los Angeles, and the collective sigh of relief from the public was palpable. The once feared shadow that had haunted the streets was now behind bars. Yet, even though Richard was physically confined, the full impact of his crimes and his continued manipulation of the media, the police, and even his own family would only come to light in the following months. As the months passed following his capture, the country watched with morbid fascination as the details of Richard Ramirez's life and his spree of horrific crimes became clearer. He had not only been a cold-blooded killer, but also a master manipulator, someone who had chosen violence not just for self-gratification, but to evoke terror on an unimaginable scale. The killer who had once been nothing more than an elusive, faceless specter was now the subject of public scrutiny, and his trial would be one of the most highly anticipated and chilling in American history. The media circus surrounding the trial was enormous. News outlets covered every aspect of his arrest, his motives, and his personal history. The public had already heard the sensational headlines. The Night Stalker, a Satan-worshipping killer, had terrorized Los Angeles with his sadistic murders and violent rampages. They learned of his twisted obsession with Satanism and the occult, how he had left behind bizarre symbols at crime scenes, how he had stalked his victims in the night, and how his brutal crimes ranged from rape to murder to attempted murder. But as the trial date neared, more gruesome details were uncovered, and the true extent of Richard's depravity was revealed. Richard's court appearances became events in themselves, as he garnered attention not only for his crimes, but for his behavior in the courtroom. He had no intention of quietly facing his charges. Instead, Richard relished his newfound attention, often smirking, glaring, or making strange hand gestures. His antics only added to his mythic, monstrous persona. The trial officially began on July 22, 1988. Richard Ramirez, now 28 years old, was charged with 14 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, 14 counts of burglary, and 13 counts of robbery. He was facing the death penalty, and there was no question that the public wanted justice for the terror he had inflicted on the city of Los Angeles. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Henry Nicholas, was determined to ensure that Richard would never see the light of day again. It was a case that was anything but ordinary. Richard's defense attorney, however, was faced with a difficult task. There was no doubt about his guilt. Richard had confessed to the murders and had been linked to many of the crime scenes. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence against him, including his fingerprints, DNA, and the testimony of victims who had survived his attacks. What remained for the defense was to try to save him from the death penalty by arguing that he had been mentally unstable at the time of the killings. They painted Richard as a man whose childhood had been marred by trauma, abuse, and a destructive influence from his older cousin, Miguel, who had exposed him to violent and horrific behavior at a young age. Miguel had been a key influence on Richard's early life. As a child, Richard had looked up to his older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who had regaled him with stories of the atrocities he had witnessed during his time in combat. These stories, combined with Richard's own exposure to domestic violence and his father's erratic behavior, helped to shape his twisted worldview. The defense argued that Richard had been deeply influenced by this trauma and that it had contributed to his violent tendencies. They hoped to use this argument to convince the jury that Richard's actions, while heinous, were the result of an unstable mind and a tortured upbringing. Yet Richard himself was not a passive participant in his own trial. In fact, he appeared to relish the spectacle of it all. From the moment he entered the courtroom, he began to engage in a strange, theatrical performance. He was frequently seen smirking, gesturing toward the media, or even flashing a pentagram drawn on his palm. On one infamous occasion, Richard raised his hand in the courtroom and shouted, "Hail Satan," before laughing maniacally. It was a chilling moment that further cemented his reputation as a sadistic, Satan-obsessed killer. His behavior in court only added to the grotesque nature of the case, leaving the public both horrified and fascinated by his complete lack of remorse. Despite the shocking evidence against him, Richard's attitude in court seemed to convey a sense of detachment, as if he were above it all. He seemed entirely unconcerned with his fate, almost as if he viewed the trial as yet another stage in his larger performance. This arrogance, this sense of superiority, was a stark reminder of just how deeply disturbed Richard had become. He wasn't just a man on trial for his crimes. He was a man who truly believed that he was invincible, that he was untouchable. The prosecution, for their part, did not shy away from presenting the gruesome details of Richard's crimes. They painstakingly laid out each of his murders, detailing the methods he had used to break into the homes of his victims, the terror he had inflicted upon them, and the brutality of his attacks. They also highlighted the connection between his crimes and his satanic beliefs, pointing to the pentagrams he had left behind at several of the crime scenes, as well as his obsession with the occult. The prosecution argued that Richard had committed these crimes not just for pleasure, but as a form of worship, a ritualistic sacrifice to the devil. Victim impact statements were also a crucial part of the trial. Survivors of Richard's attacks took the stand to describe the horrors they had experienced. One by one, they recounted the terror they had felt when they realized they were being attacked by the Night Stalker. They spoke of the fear that gripped them as they fought for their lives, of the physical and emotional scars that would remain with them forever. For some, their testimony was an act of defiance, a way to confront the monster who had shattered their lives. For others, it was a form of closure, an opportunity to be heard and to tell the world what had happened to them. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Richard's defense was struggling. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his bizarre behavior in court only served to alienate the jury. The defense's argument of mental illness had little effect. Richard's actions, the jury concluded, were not the result of a broken mind, but rather the result of a man who had consciously chosen to commit unspeakable acts of violence. The prosecution's case was airtight, and it was only a matter of time before Richard would face his fate. Finally, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Richard Ramirez was found guilty of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, 14 counts of burglary, and 13 counts of robbery. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and horror. Richard had been convicted, but the question of his punishment still loomed. Would he receive the death penalty, as the prosecution had argued? Or would he be given life in prison, a fate that some felt was more fitting for a man who had shown no remorse for his actions? The answer came on November 7, 1989, when Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and anger. For the survivors of his attacks and the families of his victims, it was a moment of justice, a moment that brought some closure to the years of fear and uncertainty. For Richard, it was another reminder of his failed rebellion against the system. He had been convicted, and now he would pay the price for his actions. Yet, even as he stood before the judge, Richard Ramirez remained defiant. He gave the court one last salute, a raised hand with a pentagram on his palm and a shout of "Hail Satan!" His arrogance and his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions remained unchanged. It was as if he had never truly understood the gravity of his crimes. To him, the trial had been another opportunity to bask in the attention, to continue his sick performance, and to remind the world that he was still in control, at least in his own mind. But the reality was different. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror had ended. He was now just another prisoner on death row, awaiting his final day. The monster who had once haunted the streets of Los Angeles had been contained, and justice had been served. The people of Los Angeles could finally begin to heal from the trauma Richard had caused. But his story was far from over. The legacy of the Night Stalker would continue to haunt the public consciousness for years to come. Chapter 7. Life on Death Row. Richard Ramirez's trial had come to an end, and the man who had once been the terror of Los Angeles was now confined to a small, cold cell on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The public, still reeling from the horrors he had inflicted upon them, was left to grapple with the fact that the so-called Night Stalker was no longer a free man. His conviction and sentencing to death marked the end of one chapter. But for Richard, it was only the beginning of a new phase in his life, a phase that would be marked by years of incarceration, public fascination, and continued defiance. In the years that followed his conviction, Richard's life on death row would be a far cry from the life of the man who had once been so elusive and untouchable. His every move was now under the scrutiny of the prison system, the media, and the public. He was a symbol of fear and evil, a man who had become infamous not just for the brutality of his crimes, but for the audacity with which he had carried them out. Yet, despite his capture, his trial, and his conviction, Richard still maintained his sense of self-importance. He still believed, deep in his soul, that he was special, perhaps even chosen by a higher power. Death row at San Quentin was not a place for the faint of heart. The prison was notorious for housing some of California's most dangerous criminals, and it was a place where violence, tension, and despair often ruled the day. But for Richard Ramirez, this was where he would spend the remainder of his life. Unless, of course, the state of California decided to follow through with his execution. In the years following his conviction, Richard had little choice but to adjust to the harsh reality of life on death row. He was kept in solitary confinement, away from the general population, where the conditions were designed to break a man's spirit. His cell was small, with little in the way of comfort. It was a stark, windowless room, the walls painted in a dull shade of gray. He had little access to the outside world, and his interactions with other prisoners were limited. For most men, this isolation would have been unbearable, but for Richard, it was merely another form of control, a reminder of his power. Richard's days were spent in a monotonous routine. He was allowed 1 hour of exercise each day, which he spent pacing the small yard alone, or sometimes speaking with his fellow death row inmates. But most of his time was spent in his cell, where he had little to do but think. Despite the isolation, Richard's mind remained sharp. He had a fascination with the media, and the media in turn had a fascination with him. His story was far from over. His conviction had not dampened the public's obsession with him. It had only fueled it. And so, Richard continued to garner attention, albeit in a different way. Over the years, Richard became something of a celebrity. His case continued to make headlines, and his name remained on the tip of everyone's tongue. He was not just a killer, but an icon, a symbol of evil that people could not stop talking about. This notoriety was something Richard relished. He still received fan mail from people who saw him as a misunderstood figure, even as he languished in prison. Many of these letters came from women who were drawn to his dark charisma, his notoriety, and the twisted allure of his persona. Richard, always eager to engage with anyone who would listen, would write back to his admirers, indulging in the attention that he had once craved. In one of the more bizarre twists of his life behind bars, Richard became involved in a series of relationships with female admirers who were convinced that he had been wrongfully convicted or that he was misunderstood. These women, many of whom had no idea the true extent of his crimes, would visit him in prison, attend his court hearings, and even engage in correspondence with him. Richard, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention, even though he knew that none of these women could ever truly understand the darkness that lived inside him. He played the role of the charming, misunderstood man, feeding into the fantasies of those who believed that his past actions were either a result of circumstances or that he had been wrongly accused. One of the most notorious aspects of Richard's life in prison was his continued devotion to Satanism. He had long been a follower of the occult, and even behind bars, he maintained his commitment to these beliefs. He would frequently draw pentagrams on his hands, speak about his admiration for Satan, and even claim that he was in communication with dark forces. His beliefs, like everything else in his life, were a way to assert control. They were a form of rebellion, a way for him to continue to define his identity in a world that had tried to strip him of it. Richard's satanic beliefs were not just a passing phase or a teenage rebellion. They were deeply ingrained in his psyche. His obsession with the occult had begun at a young age, and it had only deepened as he grew older. He had been exposed to satanic imagery and rituals during his time with his cousin Miguel, a man whose experiences in Vietnam had seemingly pushed him to embrace a dark, nihilistic worldview. For Richard, Satanism was more than just a belief. It was a justification for his violent actions. It allowed him to see himself as something more than human, as a vessel for a dark, otherworldly power. Behind the prison walls, Richard continued to preach this message of darkness, even as the authorities tried to keep him isolated from the outside world. He was a man of contradictions, a killer who spoke of evil but who, in his own mind, saw himself as an agent of something greater. He wasn't just a man on death row. He was a man who still believed in his own power, his own righteousness. This defiance was not just directed at the authorities, but at the world itself. Richard was a man who had taken control of his own narrative, and he was determined to live out the rest of his life on his own terms. Yet, despite his bravado, Richard's situation was becoming increasingly dire. The wheels of justice were turning slowly, but they were turning nonetheless. The legal battles surrounding his case continued for years, with Richard's defense attorneys filing numerous appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction. They argued that Richard had been unfairly treated during his trial, that his mental state had been inadequately assessed, and that he had been denied a fair hearing. But despite these efforts, the conviction remained intact. California's death penalty system was notoriously slow, and Richard found himself waiting on death row for what would seem like an eternity. The long years of waiting, the endless appeals, and the ever-present threat of execution were enough to break most men. But Richard remained resolute, clinging to the belief that he was untouchable. It was during this time that Richard's health began to deteriorate. The stress of years spent on death row, coupled with his deteriorating mental and physical state, began to take its toll. He was diagnosed with various ailments, including liver failure, and his once pristine image of invincibility began to crack. Even as the years passed, Richard continued to make headlines, but now it was for his health issues rather than his crimes. He had become a symbol of something darker, a man who had been consumed by his own actions, his own beliefs, and his own demons. His body, once the vessel of his power, was now deteriorating from the inside out. Despite these personal challenges, Richard's legacy lived on. He was a name that would not be forgotten, not just because of the crimes he had committed, but because of the way he had shaped the public's perception of evil. The name Night Stalker was etched into the cultural consciousness of America, a reminder of the terror that Richard Ramirez had unleashed upon the world. Even in death, Richard's influence would persist, a symbol of the darkness that can take root in the human soul. For Richard, the end would come quietly, without the fanfare that he had once craved. On June 7, 2013, he died of complications related to his long-standing battle with cancer. He was 53 years old. The man who had once been a symbol of evil and terror was gone, but his legacy would continue to haunt the public's imagination for years to come. Chapter 8. The End of a Legacy. Richard Ramirez's death, on June 7, 2013, after a prolonged battle with cancer, seemed to be a long-awaited conclusion to a life steeped in violence, darkness, and infamy. Yet, even after his passing, The shadow of the Night Stalker continued to linger over both the victims' families and the cultural landscape. His legacy, marked by his horrific crimes, his unrepentant defiance, and his eerie ability to captivate the public's imagination, would never truly fade. As the years rolled on, Ramirez's name remained a haunting reminder of the horrors he unleashed on Los Angeles during the mid-1980s, and his story continued to be revisited, dissected, and retold in countless forms. After his death, Richard's body was cremated, but his infamy was far from over. His name remained etched in the public consciousness, appearing in documentaries, books, and articles. His case became a reference point in discussions of criminal psychology, as experts attempted to understand the mind of a killer who, despite his numerous confessions and the overwhelming evidence against him, still maintained a facade of invincibility. The questions surrounding his behavior, his motives, and his apparent lack of remorse were debated in university classrooms, on true crime podcasts, and in the media. Richard had become more than just a killer. He had become an enigma, an archetype of the evil that lurks in the darkest corners of humanity. For the victims and their families, however, the story did not end with his death. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by the actions of one man, and even in the years following his conviction and death, they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Many had spent decades living in fear, struggling with trauma, and dealing with the emotional and psychological scars that Richard's crimes had left behind. For some, his passing brought a sense of closure, but it also reignited painful memories. For others, the idea of a criminal like Richard Ramirez, who had taken so much from them, being allowed to die in prison seemed like a small form of justice, but not nearly enough to make up for the suffering he had caused. The legacy of the Night Stalker was marked by a strange paradox. On one hand, the public's obsession with his crimes seemed unquenchable, while on the other, his victims and their families wanted nothing more than to move on from the nightmare he had created. His story continued to generate interest, but for those directly affected by his actions, it was a constant reminder of the horrors they had endured. The relentless media coverage of Richard's life and crimes became a point of contention, particularly in the years following his death. True crime documentaries, books, and podcasts were created to explore his reign of terror, to examine the psyche of a man who had been driven to commit unspeakable acts of violence. While some of these projects sought to understand the factors that contributed to his behavior, examining his upbringing, his exposure to violence, and his satanic beliefs, others were more interested in sensationalizing his crimes for entertainment value. His case became a form of spectacle, a grotesque form of entertainment that drew millions of viewers, listeners, and readers who were captivated by the macabre details of his life. Yet, even as Richard's image continued to be broadcast across television screens and computer monitors, there were those who felt uncomfortable with the ongoing fascination with a man who had caused so much suffering. Critics argued that the true crime genre, in its unrelenting pursuit of stories like Richard's, often neglected the voices of the victims, turning them into mere background noise while elevating the killers to celebrity status. For the families of those who had died at Richard's hands, the continued focus on him felt like a betrayal, as if their pain and grief were being overshadowed by the attention given to the man who had caused it. One of the most disturbing aspects of Richard's posthumous fame was the continued interest from female admirers. Even after his death, there were women who expressed a disturbing admiration for the Night Stalker, some of whom had written to him during his time in prison, offering their support, love, and even marriage proposals. Richard's death did not end this bizarre and unsettling phenomenon. His continued appeal to a subset of fans who romanticized his image as a misunderstood, charismatic killer only served to fuel the unsettling nature of his legacy. His role as a dark symbol, a figure of evil and allure, had become so deeply embedded in pop culture that his death seemed to only enhance his mystique, rather than diminish it. In contrast to the women who idolized him, Richard's family was largely absent from the public discourse in the years following his conviction. His parents had passed away long before his trial, and his siblings, while supportive of him during the trial, distanced themselves from him as he grew older. Richard had been a source of shame for many members of his family, and after his arrest, they withdrew from the public eye. While his mother had defended him during his early years in prison, insisting that he was innocent, the reality of his guilt was undeniable, and his family chose to remain silent in the aftermath of his conviction. Richard's legacy was also one of contradiction. On one hand, he had committed some of the most heinous crimes in American history, murders that shocked the nation with their brutality. On the other hand, he had been a man who had come from a broken home, who had suffered abuse and trauma from an early age, and who had been deeply influenced by dark forces in his life. There was a sense that Richard's story was not just the story of an individual, but the story of a society that had failed him. He was a product of a broken system, a system that allowed for the development of a killer so deeply disturbed, yet so cunning, that he had evaded capture for years. This duality, this tension between Richard as a man and Richard as a symbol, was at the heart of the public's continued fascination with him. Despite the years that had passed since his conviction, Richard's case remained a topic of intense debate. His actions had forced the public to confront difficult questions about the nature of evil, the psychology of criminals, and the impact of trauma on an individual's behavior. His crimes had challenged the very notion of what it meant to be human, as they seemed to defy any form of rational explanation. Was Richard Ramirez simply a monster, a man who was born evil and chose to inflict pain on the world? Or was he the product of circumstances beyond his control, a man whose troubled upbringing and exposure to violence had shaped his worldview and his actions? The questions surrounding his life and crimes remain unanswered. And perhaps that is what makes Richard Ramirez's story so unsettling. His legacy is one that will never be fully understood. Even in death, the Night Stalker continues to captivate, horrify, and intrigue. In the years following Richard's death, his case continued to serve as a touchstone in the study of criminal behavior and psychology. Psychologists and criminologists alike examined his life and crimes in an attempt to understand the twisted mind of a serial killer, and his case became a reference point for discussions about the intersection of trauma, mental illness, and criminality. Richard's crimes had been the result of a complex interplay of factors: his upbringing, his exposure to violence, his mental state. And yet, he had become a symbol of something much larger, a representation of the darkness that can take root in the human soul. For the survivors of his attacks, however, the story had ended long before Richard's death. They were left to carry the weight of their trauma, to live with the scars, both physical and emotional, that he had inflicted on them. Their lives had been irrevocably changed by the Night Stalker, and while justice had been served, there was no undoing the damage that had been done. They were left with the painful knowledge that, no matter how much time passed, they would always be haunted by the man who had brought terror to their lives. Chapter 9: The Unraveling Mind. The years following Richard Ramirez's death continued to cast a dark shadow over the cultural landscape, as his legacy morphed from that of a convicted killer into a subject of study, fascination, and myth. For the survivors of his brutal attacks, the pain of those horrific moments never truly dissipated. Time did not heal all wounds. It only made them more entrenched, more suffocating. And as for the public, the monster they had once feared in the dark corners of Los Angeles had transformed into a symbol, a representation of all that was wicked, unfathomable, and ultimately unknowable. The media, ever hungry for new angles, continued to feed this insatiable appetite for the story of Richard Ramirez. Documentaries, books, podcasts, and TV shows, all chronicling his life, his crimes, and the psychological underpinnings of his behavior, became a thriving industry in itself. The phrase Night Stalker was no longer just the title of a criminal, but a phrase synonymous with terror. It had entered the lexicon of American criminal history, a name that evoked images of shadowy figures lurking in the dark, watching, waiting, striking without warning. But as the public's obsession with Ramirez persisted, the survivors of his crimes had to face the reality that their lives would forever be tied to the horror he had inflicted upon them. In some ways, they were trapped in the same unending nightmare that Ramirez himself had been a part of. Even in death, Richard had not released them from the terror he had caused. The psychological effects of his crimes were profound, and not just for the families and individuals directly affected. For many, the very idea of the Night Stalker became a symbol of fear itself. People began to question the safety of their own homes, wondering if the darkness outside held more than just their own reflections. Ramirez's crimes had set in motion a series of psychological and social reactions that reverberated throughout American society. But what of the man himself? Even in prison, as he faced the consequences of his actions, Richard Ramirez's mind was a labyrinth of contradictions and justifications. The world saw him as a monster, but in his own eyes, he had always been something more, a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and even righteousness. He had never viewed himself as a mere killer. He believed, in his warped view of the world, that he was a chosen one, someone destined to inflict chaos upon an unjust society. Richard's religious beliefs, particularly his devotion to Satanism, played a significant role in shaping his identity, even behind bars. His adherence to these beliefs allowed him to view his actions as part of a larger, cosmic battle, one that pitted him against the forces of good. In his mind, he was not the villain, but the hero of his own story. He was a soldier of darkness, and every life he took, every crime he committed, was part of a greater plan. This delusional view of himself as an agent of chaos helped him maintain a sense of control over his life, even when that life had been reduced to a solitary cell on death row. Richard's interactions with the outside world, his letters, his fans, his supporters, allowed him to continue feeding this sense of importance. Even from his prison cell, he could not escape the adoration of those who saw him as a misunderstood figure, a martyr for his beliefs. The letters he received from his female admirers often contained words of love, admiration, and devotion. Some even went so far as to express a desire to marry him, despite the horrors he had inflicted upon so many. These women, many of whom had no real understanding of the magnitude of his crimes, saw Richard through the lens of romanticized myth. A prisoner of war, a man misunderstood, a figure of rebellion against societal norms. The fact that Ramirez was able to maintain this image in the public's eye only served to deepen the unsettling nature of his legacy. For the women who wrote to him, Richard was not a monster. They saw him as a tragic, misunderstood figure. And in his responses, he played into these fantasies, presenting himself as something more than just a killer. He engaged in long conversations with these women, drawing out their admiration, encouraging their beliefs, and perpetuating his image as a man above and beyond the crimes he had committed. This bizarre phenomenon was not unique to Richard. Many infamous criminals throughout history have attracted similar attention. But in Ramirez's case, it seemed to be an extension of his own delusions of grandeur. Yet, while Richard continued to indulge in his warped fantasies, his health was deteriorating. The physical toll of his years of incarceration, coupled with his diagnosis of terminal cancer, began to take a visible toll on him. He had once been a man who had thrived on attention, who had reveled in the fear and adoration of the public. But now, confined to his prison cell, slowly dying, he was confronted with his own mortality. The irony was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had lived for so long under the illusion of invincibility, who had believed that he was above the laws of men and nature, and yet now he was facing the inevitability of his own death. The very thing he had spent years avoiding, his own demise, was now unavoidable. His body, once an instrument of terror, had begun to fail him, and his mind, once sharp and calculating, had begun to dull under the weight of his disease. In his final months, Richard's health continued to decline. He was moved from San Quentin to the Marin General Hospital in Greenbury, California, where he would spend his last days. During this time, he received an unusual amount of attention from the public. The media, which had once been captivated by his every move, was now fixated on his final moments. The idea that a man who had evaded justice for so long was now being slowly consumed by cancer seemed to offer a sense of poetic justice for many. Despite his condition, Richard remained defiant. He refused to acknowledge the severity of his illness, and he continued to speak about his satanic beliefs and his desire for death with an eerie calm. To the very end, he was consumed by his own delusions, convinced that he was untouchable, that his fate was not one to be determined by the forces of nature or man. He continued to believe, to the last, that he was special, a man chosen for a higher purpose, even as his body betrayed him. But in the end, there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the age of 53. The man who had once haunted the streets of Los Angeles, who had terrorized the city and left a trail of death in his wake, was now gone. Yet his legacy remained. The name Night Stalker continued to evoke fear, fascination, and revulsion. For the families of his victims, Richard's death did not erase the scars he had left behind. For them, the story of Richard Ramirez was not one of poetic justice. It was a story of loss, trauma, and the long, slow process of healing. They had lived with the horror of his actions for decades, and while his death might have brought some measure of closure, it could never bring back the lives he had taken. Richard's legacy, however, would live on. It would live on in the media, in the public's continued fascination with his life, and in the studies of criminal behavior and psychology. His name would forever be linked to the idea of evil, an evil that was not born of some supernatural force, but of a disturbed, broken mind that found its outlet in violence and terror. In the end, Richard Ramirez's story was not one that could be neatly tied up with a sense of closure. It was a story that raised more questions than it answered. What had driven him to kill? What had turned him into the man who could commit such unspeakable acts? And what did his story tell us about the nature of evil, the capacity for violence within us all, and the ways in which society sometimes fails to protect its most vulnerable? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is what makes Richard Ramirez's story so disturbing. He was not just a man, he was a symbol of the darkness that can take root in the human soul, and the terrifying reality that sometimes there are no simple answers to the question of why. Chapter 10. The Enduring Echo. The legacy of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, continues to reverberate through the collective consciousness of the American public, even long after his death in 2013. The very name Night Stalker evokes images of terror, a reminder of a man who stalked the dark corners of Los Angeles in the 1980s, committing heinous crimes that left a trail of death and suffering. Yet, in the years that followed his conviction, his notoriety only seemed to grow as the public's obsession with his crimes persisted. This final chapter is not just about the man, but about the impact of his actions on his victims, their families, and society at large. It is also an exploration of the unsettling way in which evil can become a part of the collective imagination, creating a figure that transcends the ordinary limits of horror. For the families of his victims, Richard's death did not mark the end of their suffering. His passing did not erase the pain that they had carried with them for decades. For the survivors of his attacks, his death was not the closure they had hoped for. It was merely a reminder of the violence that had shaped their lives. In the years following his death, many found themselves still haunted by the memories of that night, when a man broke into their homes, and their lives were forever changed. There was no true sense of justice for them, only the painful reality that they would always carry the scars, both physical and emotional, that Richard Ramirez had inflicted upon them. For many of the survivors, the psychological toll of Ramirez's attacks was profound. The fear that had once gripped them in the dead of night returned in waves, triggered by the smallest of things. The sound of a door creaking open in the dark, the feeling of someone watching them when they were alone, the sudden flash of a memory. The effects of the trauma lingered long after Richard was convicted. It was a form of haunting that no amount of time could fully heal. And when Ramirez died, it did not bring a sense of peace. It simply amplified the isolation that many of his victims still felt. They had been survivors, but the emotional damage would last far longer than any prison sentence. Even more unsettling was the ongoing public fascination with Richard Ramirez. His crimes, his personality, and his lack of remorse turned him into a figure who was endlessly analyzed, dissected, and studied. His case became a touchstone for criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts alike, all eager to understand the man behind the mask of terror. Documentaries were made, books were written, podcasts aired, and countless articles and discussions analyzed his every move, every detail of his upbringing, his psychology, and the twisted logic behind his actions. Richard, in death, had become a cultural phenomenon, a figure whose life was as compelling as the very crimes he committed. This posthumous fame, this enduring fascination, was a deeply unsettling aspect of his legacy. The public's obsession with the psychology of the killer, the mechanics of his crimes, and the theories surrounding his motivations seemed to overshadow the human cost of his actions. For the families who had lost loved ones, Richard was not a subject for academic debate or a character to be sensationalized in films and television shows. He was a man who had destroyed their lives. He was not a figure to be studied, but a killer who should have been forgotten. Yet, the media's voracious appetite for sensationalism ensured that his name remained in the spotlight. One of the most disturbing aspects of Richard's posthumous fame was the continued admiration he attracted from a small but devoted group of followers, particularly women. Even after his conviction and death, there were still those who viewed him as a symbol of rebellion, an anti-hero who had fought against societal norms. This twisted adoration began while he was in prison, as female admirers sent him letters, gifts, and marriage proposals. The allure of the Night Stalker seemed to transcend his crimes, with some women professing love for him despite his history of violence and terror. Some even believed that he was innocent, refusing to accept the overwhelming evidence that convicted him. His ability to attract these women, who idealized him as a misunderstood figure, revealed a darker side of human nature. The tendency to romanticize evil, to create heroes out of those who should be seen as monsters. The phenomenon of women falling in love with killers is not unique to Richard Ramirez, nor is it new. Many infamous criminals throughout history have attracted similarly devoted followers, often those who seek to unravel the mystery of the criminal mind or feel drawn to the idea of saving someone whom society has condemned. In Ramirez's case, this adulation was disturbing not only because of the brutal crimes he had committed, but because it represented a deep disconnect between reality and fantasy. To these women, Richard was not the monster who had killed, raped, and terrorized hundreds of people. He was an enigmatic figure, a man who had been misunderstood, someone whose violence was somehow justified in their eyes. This phenomenon, which continued even after his death, only reinforced the twisted nature of his legacy. For others, Richard Ramirez represented a more significant societal issue. He was the embodiment of the failure of the criminal justice system, the inability of society to prevent such a man from slipping through the cracks. Ramirez's upbringing, which was filled with violence, trauma, and neglect, seemed to suggest that his path toward becoming a killer had been predetermined by a system that had failed him at every turn. His actions raised difficult questions about the nature of evil, the role of society in shaping the behavior of its members, and the limits of punishment and rehabilitation. Some criminologists argued that Ramirez was a product of his environment, a victim of his circumstances, who had been influenced by the violence he had witnessed as a child and by his exposure to a world that seemed indifferent to his suffering. They pointed to his childhood trauma, including the physical and emotional abuse he endured, and his exposure to violent images and satanic beliefs, as factors that shaped his worldview and contributed to his eventual turn toward murder. While this view was not meant to excuse his actions, it raised important questions about the impact of childhood trauma and the potential for individuals to spiral into violent behavior if not properly supported. Others, however, maintained that Richard Ramirez was a rare breed, a psychopath driven not by his upbringing or experiences but by an intrinsic malice. These experts argued that his actions were not the result of a broken system, but rather the result of a mind that was inherently predisposed to violence. Ramirez, in their view, was a man who had made a conscious choice to kill, to revel in the suffering of others, and to satisfy his own sadistic desires. His apparent lack of remorse, his tendency to relive his crimes, and his unrepentant attitude toward his victims made him a particularly chilling figure. But in the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Richard Ramirez's legacy was the realization that evil, in its purest form, cannot be easily explained or understood. Ramirez had been a man driven by his own internal demons, by the belief that he was somehow justified in his actions, by his warped sense of power and control. And yet, even in his final days, when cancer had eaten away at his body and death loomed large, he refused to relinquish the image of himself as a man who had been chosen for a higher purpose. He died as he had lived, a man who believed he was beyond the reach of the world's judgment, a man who had forever cast a shadow over the lives of those he had touched. Richard Ramirez's death did not end the story of the Night Stalker. It only added another layer to the mythos that surrounded him. His legacy, like that of so many infamous criminals, continued to grow, perpetuated by the media, by the public's fascination, and by the unanswered questions that his life left behind. In the years since his death, his story has been retold time and time again in books, documentaries, and articles that attempt to make sense of a man who defied logic and reason. But for the victims, the survivors, and the families who had been torn apart by Richard Ramirez's actions, there was no closure, no sense of finality. Their lives would never be the same, and while justice had been served, the emotional scars would remain forever. The Night Stalker had left an indelible mark on their lives, one that would never fade, no matter how much time passed or how many documentaries were made. In the end, Richard Ramirez's legacy is one that is difficult to reconcile. He was a man who had caused unimaginable pain and suffering, yet he also became a figure who continued to captivate the public's imagination. His story is a stark reminder of the darkness that exists in the world and the ways in which it can take root in the human soul. Richard Ramirez's life and death have become a part of American criminal history, a dark chapter that continues to haunt the collective memory of a nation. If you dare to know more, to peer into the deepest, most terrifying corners of the human soul, to unearth the darkness that lurks behind every closed door, then like, share, and subscribe. But be warned, the journey you're about to take doesn't end here. One click, one step closer to the nightmare that waits in the shadows. The darkness doesn't just watch, it listens, and it may come for you next. Will you answer its call? Or will you run, knowing you've already crossed the line? Like, share, and subscribe if you dare. You may never be the same again.